Recording. Okay, great. So, hello everyone. This is a casual conversation between me, Haider, and Mshary. What spawned this conversation is a tweet that I posted where I said that life is a subjective experience in an objective reality. And with most deep discussions, Twitter is not the perfect platform for having conversations about these. So Mshary suggested that we have a conversation outside of Twitter. And we'd like to explore the relationship between objectivity, subjectivity. What's the nature of reality? Is it fully objective or fully subjective or a mix in between? So I'm gonna hand it over to Mshary to talk about what he felt like he wanted to explore further. Take it away.
Thank you, Haider. So, the reason I kind of thought that this topic is worth a deeper conversation, I just want to make one thing clear, that this is not some kind of debate or trying to prove one of us right.
Yeah.
Hell, I don't think I disagree much with what Haider just said, but I think what would make this conversation really interesting is that we're trying to get at a better understanding of this whole back and forth. Is it objective? Is it subjective? What's real? What's not real? I don't feel like having a deeper conversation about that can be a waste of time. I think if we just talk about it more, we can get at a better understanding that will help us with our lives better, and it will be fun.
Exactly. So I completely agree, especially with the subject of the objectivity of reality or subjectivity. Because it's so fundamental to how we understand the world, if we dismiss it, a lot of our assumptions building on that won't be as clear as they can be if we actually paid attention to this fundamental question.
Exactly.
Okay.
Like I feel like, especially in this time in history, a lot of our world is built on science, which is very objective. Mm-hmm. But like a part of our experience as human beings is inherently subjective. So we're constantly in this conflict: is it objective, is it subjective? So I think at this time, this discussion between the two worlds is way more relevant to our lives, to our daily lives, than it's probably been in the past.
Nice. So would you be able to sum up what your outlook on it is? What's the relationship between objectivity and subjectivity?
Interesting. See, to me, the way that I see it is that this discussion is, there's multiple elements here. There's what is subjectivity, there's what is objectivity, there's what is reality, and there's what is truth. But behind all of that, the thing that I see most often in this discussion, this conversation, is what is the motivation of everyone involved? Oh. What does something, like, if the world is objective, what does that mean to you? Why do you think it's subjective? Why do you think that the thing that, so to me, if something is true, what makes it true is that it explains other parts of your life. And so to you, if reality is objective, that explains more things in your life than if reality was subjective. So what's going on in your life? It's a big part of it. What's going on in your life that leads you to think one over the other,
Okay, so this is excellent, because the thing is, as I was growing up, and specifically before going to university, I started having these existential questions like, why am I Muslim? How do I know what reality is? Am I just accepting the beliefs I was brought up in, or do I believe in them because they're true? What's the evidence? So I started I became interested in epistemology, which is the science of knowledge, without really knowing that epistemology existed. So some of the questions that I was exploring, one of them being, what is the nature of reality? but also exploring our intentions when it comes to our beliefs, like, which is exactly what you said. So, uh, and after that, I had conversations with people that believed in subjectivity and or also subjectivity and moral relativism, because their intention was they don't want people imposing their beliefs on others. Therefore, let's believe that reality is subjective, so no one can impose uh, their beliefs on anyone else. But notice how the intention, or like the outcome that they wanted, informed their approach to understanding what the nature of reality is.
Exactly. Yeah. And to me, I see this a lot where where the person who's advocating for subjective reality as the truth, uh, they might be motivated, as you just said, by being oppressed. That to them, if the world was inherently subjective, that means you don't have. It makes no sense that you would tell me what to believe, because there is no one truth. There is my
Yeah,
truth and there's your truth. But the way that I see it is that it's a bit of both. So I think moral relativism, there is truth to it, but it's not the complete truth. There's also objective morality. And there's a combination of both that constitutes the truth. So I think, so, and let's take the example of, um, okay, so this is a religious example, but it still applies in a non-religious context. So in Islam, it's haram to drink alcohol, which is completely true. That's objectively true. There's nothing about that that you can take apart. However, Islam is generally considerate enough to tell you that if you are starving to death and you have no drink and you have no water and you're in the desert, no people around you to help you, and you're about to die of thirst, and you only have a bottle of alcohol, it's okay to drink it to keep yourself alive.
mm,
So you can see like in that subjective situation, the objective rule, the objectivity of that truth becomes subservient to the subjectivity of the experience,
yeah.
right?
Uh, but this also touches on the idea. So there are two things to discuss. One is what is the nature of reality, and then what is the nature of morality. And the point, the example that you gave about alcohol being permissible, um, it touches on this point of, is morality absolute, in that a single principle is always applicable regardless of context or circumstance, or there are some conditions to moral principles. So something, for example, thou shalt not kill, uh, has a footnote, or I think a very long footnote. Like, you shouldn't kill people, but there are so many exceptions. So and that's the point about like morality, and it's not just absolute or relative. It's also, is it objective? So if I hold certain moral positions, are they true because I believe in them, or is there something beyond my perception, beyond my beliefs, beyond my opinions, which I should compare my moral values against? So that's also an interesting topic to explore.
Interesting.
Okay, but can we? So let's go back to just specifically the nature of reality, in terms of, is it objective or subjective?
Okay.
Would you like to give a brief on what your take on it is?
Yeah. So let's see.
And you might
So
as well explain the meaning of life while you're at it.
yeah, I don't see why not. So is it okay, I think, okay, I think ultimately
Mm-hmm.
I don't, and I want to emphasize that ultimately,
Yeah.
it's an objective reality with a subjective experience of that objective reality.
Okay.
Ultimately, it's important that it's just the final picture. But
You
in our daily
emphasize
lives,
ultimately so much. I feel like there's a huge footnote
There is a big one, yes.
Okay.
It's a big one. So y- I think that's true, but that doesn't mean you can live your daily life thinking that the world is objective. Because at the end of the day, like, yani, what you think of as something that's objective is only your subjective experience of that objective thing. So it's kind of like this. It's kind of like, and while this mug of coffee, you can see I spilled some coffee here before.
Yeah.
Um,
Objectively spilled some coffee.
objectively, so this objectively exists. This there is like objectively there's an actual mug of coffee right here,
Yeah.
right? I can't think my way out of the reality of the existence of this object.
Hmm.
However, whatever I see when I look at it, no matter what, that remains subjective, because I can't see the full existence of this object, and there's always stuff that I don't see. There's always stuff that I don't know. So whatever I know of this objective truth, it's only a side of it, like just a small part of it. And so there's a bit of humility in that, because you always have to say that you don't know everything about something, even if you like can see the full object. Is this making sense?
Yes. So even like because there's depth of knowledge, not just about the object itself, it's about also how this object behaves in different circumstances. Like when you drop the cup, what's going to happen? Will it break or not break? What kind of floor would it drop on that would lead it to break? Like there are certain behavioral traits. Looking at the object alone doesn't mean that you fully encompass that object in all circumstances and to all like levels of knowledge. There's so much that maybe you're not aware of. You know what I mean? Like even
Exactly.
for example, the way it was made. Like we we can see the cup, we can use the cup, we don't know how it's made, and that's an aspect of the cup itself, an aspect of the object we may not be aware of.
Exactly. Like you brought up the example of if you drop the cup on the floor, it's going to break. Um, th- there's a lot of any objective rules that can be applied into that. Like there's nothing subjective about that, about the thing that happens when you drop the cup. It's going to break. Um, but so you might use the argument and think the ultimate reality is objective, because you can't, there's nothing you can do about that to change it. It's objectively true no matter who you are, no matter what you think.
Yeah.
But at the same time, that is only true in a very narrow set of conditions. You know what I mean? If you drop the same cup in space, it's not going to crash anywhere. And so uh, the
Yes.
truth, the objective truth in that is that if you drop a cup that may break, like the type of material that breaks, uh, in, in a place where there is gravity that's strong enough to break it, on a floor that's hard enough to break it, and you are, yeah, so under these circumstances, then this objective truth applies.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so the conditions are also important, because sometimes I don't remember where I mentioned this. Actually, I think I tweeted about it. There's this challenge where you have to explain a process to someone who knows nothing about the process. So there's like a funny video on YouTube where children are explaining to their father how to prepare a peanut butter sandwich. Okay. But the instructions they give have to be so precise. Otherwise, he takes it at face value and interprets it literally. So when you say, they say, okay, uh, take take some peanut butter and put it on the bread. So you've not told him to open the jar. So he just smacks the top of the jar because he doesn't know what to do next. Like he got stuck on that point. And then you say, okay, let's revise it and say, open the jar. And then he doesn't know how to open it. Like, does he smack it on the table or not? So the reason why I mentioned this is that sometimes when we make a statement, we're not taking into consideration other scenarios or other uh, conditions where that is not true. So when we talk about cups breaking, like if you drop it on the floor, it's going to break. We're assuming that the sort of the fixed variable or the control variable is there will always be gravity, which is what makes the statement true. But sometimes we overlook the fact that there are certain conditions or a different context that makes the statement false.
Exactly. That's exactly true. That's exactly true. That's kind of why, to me, it's a, to me, the truth that matters to us, the truth that we take and play with every single day, is not is not then it's not whether reality is objective or not, because the game that we humans play is a blend of both. Um, it's a blend of balance between the two.
Nice. I like it.
um,
I'm gonna add
because
TM after you said those words. I'll add TM in the video. I'm trademarking that.
So the person that's claiming the objective truth that the couple will crash if you fall it, um, if you drop it, they're operating under a certain set of conditions,
Yeah.
right? And so someone who's not aware of those sets of conditions that validate the objective truth that they're talking about might take that same objective truth and try to apply it in a different scenario where it doesn't really apply.
Yeah.
And then they might get confused. Well, I thought reality was objective. I thought there's one objective truth.
Mm.
It's kind of true, but not in that way. And so to me, it's always like a dance between the subjective and the objective that's kind of, let's say, mediated by our human motivations, intentions. So it's sometimes someone would claim the objective truth, I mean the objectivity of reality, because they don't want to deal with other people's feelings about this objective law of nature, which is valid. But I get that, but you know, uh, it's not just about that. There's a bigger picture that includes all the players in the game. Um, so in that case, sometimes, yeah, I think that's all I had to say about that topic. But you get the idea I was trying to
Yeah,
communicate.
but you touched on something that's interesting. I think you mentioned it in our Twitter conversation, and then the start of this conversation, and you just repeated it, which is the dimension of emotions. So emotions are typically considered subjective, but then is there any objective reality to emotions? How should we deal with emotions? Is that something you'd like to talk about? I have some thoughts about it, but I wanted to see what if you want to share your perspective.
Interesting. Um, Emotions. You see, right now I'm in the middle of my personal journey of exploring and being in touch with my emotions.
Yeah.
So right now, the way that I'm kind of seeing it is that emotions is the bridge between the objective and the subjective. It's a subjective experience, and I'll never know your fear. You can use words to try to express it or paint a picture that might make me feel the same thing, but I'll never ever know that. That will never happen. I only know my fear, my feelings, my emotions. However, the existence of the fear, the emotion itself, it's objective. Like I objectively feel fear in this situation. That doesn't change. In
Mm.
this time, in this situation, in these conditions, I've experienced fear, and that's an objective truth. But the experience and the emotion itself is subjective. At the same time, let's say that right now I'm in a situation that makes me feel fear. I could come back into that same exact situation 10 years later and not feel fear. And so there's something that's not constant and objective about the emotion. There's an element of subjectivity. And the thing with with emotions that's really strange, I think from my experience, at least most of the time, you can think your way out of an emotion. In the midst of the situation, you can think your way out of it. And to me, if you can think your way out of something, um, then that kind of makes it less objective. Because if something is really really objective, no matter what you do, it's always going to be true, right? You can't think your way out of the reality that the cup will be crushed if you drop it on the floor. No matter what you do, no matter what you think, no matter how you see it, that's never ever going to change. Um, but emotions are much more malleable that way. Um, so emotions are a very like touchy subject in this debate, let's say, because it's really going back and forth all the time between the two.
Thank you for that. I think it's important, and like the way you framed it is interesting. The way I look at it is, uh, while discussing objectivity and subjectivity, we also need to consider a different issue, which is variability. So let's say, for example, when we talk about human beings in general, I think we exhibit very similar traits. And we can't say, if we were to say that every experience is so subjective that it has no relation with any other experience, that means we can't really have something called psychology, because there's no psyche for us to study. Because each person is experiencing their own unique take on the world and their own emotions. Uh, that means we can't learn from one experience and apply it to someone else. And even the emotions themselves. I mean, we both experience fear. It may not be exhibited to the same degree, but at least we can agree that's the kind of emotion that we're having. Or the distinction between fear, anxiety, anger, happiness, sadness, these kinds of differences in emotions, we understand them, but we may experience them to different degrees and in response to different um, circumstances, or uh, in assessing the way we assess, or with the way we understand certain conditions. So variability is really important, because sometimes, you know how, like, um, let's say when it comes to productivity, I know that's a topic we're both interested in as well. What works for you may not work for me. It doesn't mean that it's subjective in the sense that it's fully unique to you. It just means we may have different preferences. We may have different uh, types of work we're doing, different experiences that have shaped what works for us and what doesn't. But the variables remain the same. It's just um, the amounts of each variable, if that makes sense. So
It does,
when
yeah.
it talks about, for example, when we talk about emotions, or even like the thing that you mentioned about the maturity, or how your approach to the same situation, your emotional response might be different now versus 10 years from now. It doesn't mean the emotion has changed. It just means your attitude towards that situation has changed. So you're responding with a different set of emotions.
Okay, so what you were saying just made a lot of things click in my head right now. But there's one big thing that I want to share, um, and to me, I think this resolves the conflict. But let's see what you think. So you mentioned how um, you, you mentioned how the variables are the same, and that this is still fear, this is still anger, and you mentioned the objective parts of, let's say, psychology, which is generally considered something to be very subjective.
Yeah.
But the fact that we can study it tells us there's at least some aspect of it that's objective. So this kind of made me it made something crystallize in my head. So, okay, so how about this? So tell me what you think about this. The reality itself is objective. Um, let's take the example of the productivity stuff. That's all completely objective. Every variable in that productivity system game is objective. Um, and and the way that we feel in a certain situation, that's objective as well. The feelings are objective. The fact that we feel a feeling in that scenario is an objective truth. um, and I think I'm kind of working up to the introduction of subjectivity in existence, which is that, let's take the example of the the productivity system.
Mm.
If I use a tool that works perfectly for me, the objective truth is that me using this tool at this time for this work works perfectly. And so I share it with you, thinking this objective truth that it's going to work for you as well.
Mm.
But then maybe you try it and it doesn't work. And so I think that it only works for me, it doesn't work for you. But so I'm saying here that there's so many objective factors to take into account to to decide the outcome of something, to know what's going to happen. There's so many objective factors that we cannot know all of them. And so because we can't know all of them, we can't really calculate or know what's going to happen. um, and so specifically the too many objective factors thing, it only happens around human beings, because outside human beings, outside the human world, the reality, the objective reality is very, very simple. It's relatively simple. There's not much happening there. But around human beings, things start to get more and more complex, and inside a human being's mind gets even more and more complex. And so the objective truths, the objective variables inside a human mind, let's say, inside psychology, is too vast. There's way too many things to take into account if you want to know, uh, if you want to know something. And so because we can't really take that into account for every single human being in our lives, it's just ridiculous. It's impossible. Then the world of too many too many objective factors inside a single person's world, we consider that to be subjective. That's their subjective world. It's because they're the only consciousness that is aware of all of them, even unconsciously, but they're aware of all of those objective variables. And so maybe they can feel if a productivity tool is going to work or not, because they, you know, they do experience all of those too many objective factors. But someone else doesn't experience them like they do, so they don't know. And so that world around a single person that's too complex is the subjective world. But there's nothing about it that's not objectively true. There's nothing about it that doesn't exist in objectivity. Um, but
In reality, uh,
yeah,
you mentioned an excellent point, which is usually the way I make a distinction between objectivity and subjectivity. So objectivity is related to the world, as in, let's take out all living beings and assume that planets exist. This we would consider to be objective reality. But when you bring in consciousness into the picture, that's where subjectivity is introduced, because a conscious being is limited in their exposure to reality. And we're looking at it from a specific angle, we're looking at it from a limited domain. And so we're not able to, and we're not actually seeing reality exactly as it is. So we have our senses, but we're constructing our understanding of the world as we go along, and the conclusions that we draw, the principles, like you know, you're familiar with the concept of like swans. Like you see a few swans, and you say, all swans are white, and then you're exposed to a black swan, and then you think your understanding of swans has changed given the fact that you've been exposed to something which breaks your understanding of what a swan looks like. So, and the same with, like, when we talk about subjectivity, it's in terms of knowledge, it's limited based on our experience, and we're constantly learning and developing our mental map of what reality is. But that mental map is based on our limited exposure and experience. And sometimes it could be false connections that we made, if that makes sense. So, and then when it comes to emotions, that's another factor, because we respond differently to different circumstances based on how we think about those conditions. So I'm sure you've met people who panic straight away because they immediately assume the worst. Like a relative is late, they must have had a car accident. Khalas, that's it. Okay. Yeah. But then you have other people who maybe they're the opposite extreme. They're 4 hours late. I'm sure I'm sure it's nothing, you know. But then, like, you have a mix of different interpretations, and those interpretations shape the emotions that we get to experience.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask, by the way, something else which I've thought about, but I never really explored that much, which is the idea of quantum physics. You know how they say, we've been told, based on logic and based on the principle of non-contradiction, that A is A and things are what they are. But then quantum physics has changed that perception of reality, and then one thing can be the thing and not itself. So there's this introduction of contradiction in the world. What's your take on that?
Well, what do you mean by a thing can be itself and not itself?
You know, the idea of so within quantum physics, there's the idea that let's say a particle can be present in one place and also not present at the same time. There's this thought experiment, the Schrodinger's cat, I think.
Yeah, that's the one.
Yeah. So the idea is the cat is dead and not dead at the same time.
Okay, so okay, so that's I think that, like, that's the part where the debate doesn't get resolved between objectivity and subjectivity. Because I think, okay, I think mainly two things. So the first one is that we probably can't know that. It seems like it's something beyond our capacity as human beings. But the other thing is what grounds me, which is that I don't think we need to know that. I don't think we need to know that to live our lives and to pursue our goals and to live happy and to live complete, fulfilled lives.
But sorry, I'm sorry. Yeah. Going back to the point of, it's important to understand the nature of reality so we can make the most out of reality, or the most out of our lives on Earth or Mars. How would accepting quantum physics change our attitude towards life, or even the decisions that we make in life?
How would accepting quantum physics is that what you said?
Yeah. Or the basic premise of quantum physics, that the thing is, my honest opinion is that I feel like quantum physics applies to a very specific domain, the quantum level, but we're trying to extract certain principles and applying it to physical reality. So we say, when it comes to particles, they're exhibiting such behavior. Therefore, there is no logic within the quantum realm. Therefore, there's no logic, you know? But my understanding of it is, first of all, like you said, maybe us as humans, we're not capable of learning, we're not capable of understanding that quantum state. But also, we might be able to understand it, but we're kind of imposing a certain template, like a model. You know how, and again, like full disclosure, I don't understand physics at all, and I get lost like very quickly. But I feel like um, when it comes to quantum physics, understanding the quantum realm, or sorry, the example I was going to give is about the nature of light. Is it particles or a wave? It might be something in the middle, but we've not discovered a model or a concept that captures that reality. So we're looking for the next best thing, the next best example that we're familiar with. So I feel like we might be applying the same thing to quantum physics, that it's either logic or it's not logic. Therefore, it's not logic, and then we're interpreting it based on limited concepts we have available.
Yeah. um, yeah. And I think related to that, I think it's possible that the question itself is where the problem is. Because personally, I learned that you can ask questions that aren't helpful and maybe don't have answers. And so you might get stuck trying to answer a question that doesn't actually have an answer. Maybe it's the way you phrased it. Maybe the question itself is trying to find something that's just not there, and you think there should be something there and try to find it, but maybe there's actually nothing there. Maybe that's the objective reality, is that in that place where you're trying to get at to find the answer to a question, maybe there's actually nothing there. You could get really bogged down trying to answer a question that really shouldn't be attempted to be answered.
Yeah.
It's possible. And to me personally, the thing that you mentioned about how a photon can behave as a particle and as a wave, um, it might not be helpful. So this has already been answered, but it might not be helpful to ask what is a photon. It might be more helpful to ask instead, how does this thing that we call a photon, this light, how does it behave? And so that's a different way to frame the question that actually has a more grounded answer. So it behaves as light and it behaves as a photon because it has a particle. And so maybe the thing with quantum physics. So the thing with quantum physics is that it studies laws of nature smaller than the single atom, and that world of under the atom, that's governed by probability. Everything is probabilities. Everything is no real Boolean true or false, 0 or 1. That doesn't really exist down there. It's all about probabilities. And so when you go down there, I spent some time exploring quantum physics and particle physics as well.
Mm.
So, and I'm not sure exactly what. So they did a bunch of experiments that led them to see that a conscious awareness observing something is what makes it become real and basically decide if it's this or that. But the thing is that this is the level of analysis, let's say, that is way beyond our daily lives. It's way past our daily lives. And for one thing, I think for the average person, 99% of the population, if not even more, It's a complete waste of your energy to even think about that. You have way more pressing matters to, to pay attention to. You
Yeah.
get your sleep together first before you try to discuss this topic.
Yeah.
But just to give it its fair attention. So um, we don't even know what makes us exist here inside this body, as
Yeah.
opposed to just like a piece of meat that's doing stuff. Like we're actually here experiencing, we feel something when there's an emotion. We, we, we don't fully understand what makes that real. In fact, in my personal life, I saw that I don't need to know that. I really don't need to know that to continue on with my life, you know?
Yeah.
And that question of quantum physics, it's really very tightly locked with our consciousness, with our presence, our awareness, this thing that we are, I guess.
Mm.
And somehow there's like a weird marriage between the observer and the object being observed. And if you kind of imagine it, so we exist in this body that's made up of atoms, of course, but the world that creates the atoms that create us, I guess, that is kind of determined by our conscious awareness itself. Kind of. It's kind of weird. But this kind of makes like a cycle there. It's really strange. And I I don't know if we even are able to ever find an answer to that question. Maybe it's the wrong question. Maybe it's simply beyond our ability in the first place. Because I mean, we're taught in Islam that there are things we just can't know, so you shouldn't ask them.
Mm.
And I was told that it's wrong to ask them, but I learned that it's not wrong to ask them. It's just that you shouldn't ask them because that's gonna get you down a place that you don't want to be. It's
Mm.
gonna bog you down. It's gonna make you sacrifice everything that you have in life just to answer the question because you're so obsessed with it. That's gonna make you suffer. So you probably shouldn't ask it. I'm not saying that we shouldn't ask the question in quantum physics. Maybe we should. I don't know. I'm just saying that we don't think of this question as something that's going to help you in your daily life. Probably it might, but it probably won't.
Yeah.
Probably won't.
Uh, I completely agree with the approach that you're taking. And actually, I like, uh, you may be familiar with it as a concept that comes from computer science, which is the idea of a black box. So when you're writing code, sometimes you deal, let's say you have an API, you're connecting to a, a system, like software system. The black box model would say you don't really need to know how that system works internally, as long as you know what input is expected of you and what the output will look like. And uh, so, as a model, this is used a lot in computer science, but even in our daily lives, most of the things that we use, we don't really understand how it works. So I'm using my laptop now. There are so many things about my laptop that I don't know how they work. And the same applies. And my background is computer engineering. So imagine a person who never studied technology, and many people who use iPhones and like smartphones and different digital devices, they don't have exposure, or they've not really studied how these devices work, but they're able to make use of it. So sometimes we need to think of it in that way. Like whatever thing in reality is, maybe we don't need to understand fully how it works. We just need to know how to engage with it.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And personally, I think to expand on that, I think personally that so the process of inquiry that that led us to ask the question that you're asking about, especially the one about quantum physics that seems to have no clear answer, at least right now, Yani.
Yeah.
I think the process that got us to ask that, I think it initially started in the first place of just trying to have a working model of the world, to know how to interact with the world. Eventually, we get to a high enough level where we start to know what a thing is, not just how to interact with it, you know?
Yeah.
And I think eventually um, there became more and more people involved in knowing what a thing is, and they lost sight of the point in the first place, which is just to know how to live our lives, you know?
Yes. So knowledge or maybe science became for science's sake and not the application or implementation, or even like there's no clear outcome that we're seeking. So we don't know why we're pursuing the knowledge in the first place and then how to make use of it.
Yeah, and like, I want to make it clear that I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing. I think
Yeah.
it's mostly, yeah, it's mostly a good thing. It's almost entirely a good thing, but it can, because you forgot the whole point, you might find yourself in a situation where there is no point and you get stuck. I think that that's possible, and maybe that's what's happening with this kind of question,
Yeah.
possibly, you
Yeah.
know.
I really like the story of, I don't know to what extent it's true, but they say that like early cartographers, the people who make maps, when there were parts of the map that they didn't know what to fill with, like they didn't know what exists on that part of the map, they would say, here be dragons. Like dragons exist in this place because we don't know what exists in that place. So sometimes, like the pursuit of certainty, or like we want to have answers at any cost, leads us to accept conclusions that may not be true. So we have to accept the limits of our knowledge. It's not to say don't ask these questions. It's to say, okay, how would the answer benefit me? And is there a possibility that I've not reached the level of understanding enough to be able to even make sense of the answer itself?
Exactly. Like maybe it's just maybe it's just not the right time to ask this question. You know, like it's entirely possible that maybe sometime in the future, after we develop more as a species, let's say, uh, this question becomes reasonable to ask, and maybe then the answer will be a lot easier to find and a lot clearer and a lot more meaningful as well. You know,
Yeah,
I want to go back a little bit to um, uh, to basically to our motivations
yeah,
uh, be, behind these discussions. So I think I don't want to undermine this topic, but for most of the time, I think maybe for most people, instead of trying to answer the question, maybe think, why are you even asking it? What's behind it? Are you trying to avoid a feeling? Maybe you want to avoid a confrontation. Maybe someone is pressuring you to do something, and you think having this answer will guard you from having that discussion uh, with someone. And I think it's important to do that, because you could easily get bogged down and trying to answer a question like this, when all you really want is just to be brave and be courageous. Maybe that's all that you want, you
yeah.
know? Yeah.
And to build on this point, it's important, like knowing the intention or the motivation uh, might help prevent you from seeking a shortcut or the answer that you want. So, and again, going back to the question of morality, because this is where I see it a lot. People want to live their lives without being judged by others. And so they kind of lean towards subjectivity and moral relativism because they want to give themselves that space. Or even, so that's morality on one front. And intellectually, if they feel like this is not making sense, this person's belief is not making sense, and I don't want it imposed on me, maybe the model that I want to go for is reality is subjective, so you can have your views and I can have mine. But the way I see it is that um, regardless of objective truth, people need to arrive at their convictions on their own. Like, no matter how true my beliefs are, I can't impose them on others. They have to go through the process of seeing the evidence themselves, reasoning through that evidence, and reaching those conclusions. So, and we have to respect that process, like fully. You can't say, no, this is the evidence, or uh, censorship, for example. Sometimes a society or a government wants to restrict exposure to certain ideas because they want people to think in a specific way. But that almost always backfires. Like you can maintain ignorance for a while, but then people will be curious to know. And the fact that you're censoring makes people suspect the beliefs that you're protecting. They say, okay, you might be trying to protect something. Let's find out what that is.
I like that. I like that. I like that.
Is there
I like
anything
that.
else you feel we've not touched on?
Well, most of the talk we had was about the nature of reality. Not uh, there's a world of morality we can get into. Um, I just want to touch a little bit about morality.
Yeah.
So, sorry, I think I forgot what I had to say. But the right, this is the important thing that I wanted to add. So actually, I've always had, this is really foundational. So I've always had a question in the back of my head. So, but while I'm a very curious and open person, I explore Christianity and Buddhism, but I'm a very firm believer in Islam, and to me, it is a source of truth I can always come back to because I don't know everything. So at least this authority knows something. Maybe I can use it in my life. Um, but at the same time, I always decide for myself at everything. So I maintain my independence that way. But the question I've always had in my head was, in in the Prophet's time, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and in his time, did he take responsibility for if someone else does something wrong? If someone else does something wrong, or like thinks something wrong, or something a lot more subtle, not like a crime, does the Prophet go out of his way to make sure he doesn't do something like that again? Tells him to like stay in line, or did he think, no, that's his responsibility, that's his thing. I did my part in the game, and it's up to him to live his life properly. Um, Eventually, not that long ago, I saw that this question was actually answered in the Quran by two verses. I'm going to recite them now. They're really short. Uh, فذكر إنما أنت مذكر
Mm.
لست عليهم بمسيطر, which
Mm.
means remind them because you are a reminder, because you are only a reminder.
Mm.
You are not of them a controller.
Yeah.
So the thing is that, and I'm adding this because you mentioned the part about people being afraid to be judged. The
Mm.
thing is that nobody judges us at the end of the day. I mean, people will try to judge you, but that is not about the objectivity or subjectivity of morality. That's simply oppression and abuse. It's a human emotional thing. It's not a scientific physical thing. So in cases like that, uh, don't judge other people because that's too much of a job for you to do, because you can't judge them fairly because there's too many factors that play in their lives. You can't know everything to have a fair judgment, really.
Mm.
You can try, but you'll likely fail. You might get lucky and get the and hit the right judgment, but that's really luck because you don't know everything there. And so the way that I live my life is I leave the judgment of other people in God's hands because it's too much of a job for me to do. And people will try to judge you, but I mean that part is about bravery and perseverance and independence and accepting that people can be horrible sometimes. That doesn't mean they're right, and it doesn't mean it doesn't mean that there's something you can use to just shield yourself from being judged by other people all the time. Like some people might think, is truth objective or subjective, because they want to find the answer and use that to forever shield themselves from being judged and use that as a protection mechanism forever because
Mm.
they don't ever want to deal with that again, which is understandable, but that's not gonna it's not gonna work.
Yeah.
it's not really gonna work. So my point here mainly is that um, any the nature of reality and truth, if it's objective or subjective, don't try and use that in another domain. It doesn't really work. That other domain needs other tools like courage, strength, stuff like that. uh, you can't use this tool over there. It's not really going to work. It's going to fail you and you'll be miserable.
Yeah.
It's not going to work.
I think it plays a role because, let's say, for example, if you do truly believe that reality is subjective, then you're not really going like on a fundamental level. Reality is subjective. You can't really do science because science would mean you're engaging with something that's external of yourself, and then you're drawing a conclusion about the nature of that thing. But if there's nothing outside of you, then what are you doing? Or even morality. If there's nothing that's common amongst humans, it's hard to even advise others, because advising would assume that there's something that you know that's applicable to others. But if there's nothing applicable, then you can't really advise. So it does play a role, but you can't depend on this fact on whether reality is objective or subjective. Um, or maybe you should be cautious about um, leaning towards a certain definition because you want a specific lifestyle outcome or like a moral principle. Like you want your space, so you say, okay, reality is subjective, you know, like those
Yeah.
shortcuts don't work.
Exactly. It absolutely plays a significant role in the game. Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely
But,
does.
I was interested in morality as it relates to that question of subjective versus objective. But morality in itself as a topic, I feel like it needs a session on its own, because then again, like a lot of factors come into it. Subjectivity being a component, and then you have upbringing, culture, religion, reason, that kind of thing. So it's worth exploring in a separate conversation.
I agree. I agree completely.
Sounds great. So let's end here, and then we'll figure out another time to have a chat.
Yeah. Yeah. Sounds good. Sounds good.
Thank you
Sounds
very
good.
much.